All right, so I will pull this up and oh, good. Okay. So my name's Alyssa, and I also wanted to thank the GSSA for organizing, and I'm excited to be here and presenting work from my master's paper. So I welcome feedback and questions on all of it. And I'm looking at the impact of gendered relationship dynamics on contraceptive use within heterosexual couples. So just to provide some background on why birth control use is important, at the population level, there are patterns in research that are kind of hard to make sense of at times and listed here. So as you can see, a lot of women are using some sort of birth control. However, rates of unintended pregnancy are high, and some literature has found that women not intending pregnancy forego use low efficiency methods, or use inconsistently. So how do we really make sense of this? Not enough work has been done to understand what factors relate to why women do not use contraception despite being heterosexually partnered or sexually active with men. So just to expand on more of these gaps, there's also been, I would say, disproportionate focus on mostly women's characteristics, and men's role is often ignored in much of the literature. This is evidenced by the lack of quantitative work on men's role, and a lot is on specific birth control methods and not a lot on all method use. So in the literature, there's been an increasing focus on men, especially in qualitative work. However, they're still lacking, but some of this includes that women expected less control in low and high commitment relationships, and men had more control in newer forming relationships over birth control usage. However, most couples still see for a contraceptive use or fertility work in the women's sphere. And as we're trying to understand this, thinking more about how power and influence is enacted in intimate relationships, I'm following previous work in my study and identifying power as multidimensional. So in addition to typical structural markers like education and income, decision-making and gender beliefs have also been shown to impact contraceptive usage. So what I aim to do in the current study is an analysis of power dynamics in couples in relation to all method contraceptive use. And my main question is, how do these gendered relationships dynamics influence contraceptive use in couples not intending pregnancy? And I'll kind of expand a little bit more about what gendered relationships dynamics are. So as you can see, similar to the literature, I'm defining this multidimensionally using structural power, gender role beliefs, and decision-making power. And when we talk a little bit more about the measures, I can describe how I am operationalizing that. So for the questions, my specific questions in the study are more exploratory, just because there's competing explanations of how contraceptive use demonstrates power in the relationship. So I'm mostly doing exploratory work in this study. My first question is, how does structural power impact all method use? Next, are the characteristics of men or women more influential in predicting use? Third, how do levels of traditional gender role beliefs predict all method use? And four, how does decision-making power predict all method contraceptive use? So these are the questions that I organized my analysis around. So the data come from the National Couples Survey in 2005 and 2006. And although this data set is quite old, it is unique and unlike some of the other national data sets where it interviews couples together, or interviews in couple pairs, but individually. So you have reports from both the man and the woman. And in some of the national data sets, you're relying, they're just separate samples of men and women. So you're relying on either the men's or women's account of their partner. So this is a strength of this data set, that you have it from the individuals themselves in the couple. However, there are some drawbacks. The inclusion criteria in this study was kind of strict, although it is very suited for my analyses. So To be included, you couldn't be sterile or pregnant, had to be over 18 and not intending pregnancy, which is key in the question, but is exclusionary in some ways. And this totaled about 2,000 individuals and 1,009 couples. So in my analysis, I restricted my sample quite a little bit from this total. I decided to only include married and cohabitating couples just because of this, to kind of account for the seriousness of the relationship. I excluded dating couples. In addition to dating couples didn't have or missing on some key measures for my analysis. So that restricted it at 674 couples. And then I only included couples age 21 and over, just because I'm looking at education levels. So this is presumably when you're able to finish education. So my final analytic sample was around 637 couples. Although you will notice in some of the analyses in the regression I'm doing that the N is a little bit smaller than this because I'm using listwise deletion for those. So to go through my main predictors, first is women's structural power. This is separate from men's structural power. And I measured this by looking at a couple of difference in education, taking the highest tier of education completed, and then fitting that into low, middle, and high categories. And this is similarly done for income levels in women, with annual income from 2004 binned into groups. And then this process repeated for the education and income level of men. And in my analyses, basically what you are doing is matching on those levels. So you might see a couple that looks has both lower levels of education, or a couple with low and high income levels. However, for the current presentation today, I'm only going to be showing you analyses from education, just in the interest of time. In addition to these structural predictors, I looked at women's gender role beliefs, and this comes from an 8-item Likert scale from King and King, and it includes questions like a wife's career is more important than her husband's. And in this, higher scores are more traditional, and you could have a score of 8 to 40. Finally, the last predictor is women's decision-making power. And what I did for this is factor analyzed. There's a total of about 13 questions of decision-making behaviors. And I factor analyzed for it to make that down into 5 total questions that showed financial decision-making as a theme. And you can see that Cronbach's alpha right there, 0.86, so highly correlated. And included questions like who makes final decision about what type of car to get. And the responses were coded that those deciding more of the time were a 2, those where their partner is deciding more of the time is a -2, those deciding equally around a 0. So lower scores on that are indicating less decision-making power. For the main outcome measure, I'm looking at just all contraceptive use within the couple. As you can see, this is the question they were asked, and dichotomize that into just a yes, no. And then for the controls, including race, ethnicity, age, parity, how many children they already have, and pregnancy avoidance, just because those have been established as influencing use. So in my analytic design, I kind of have a stepwise with descriptives, moving to simple correlations, to logistic regression, and then finally a logistic diagonal reference model. And the diagonal reference model is unique in that it's able to model partner difference and provide relative weights for each partner's characteristics. So you can really quantify the influence that each partner has on that relationship. And I can talk a little bit more about it when we get there. So just going through some preliminary findings of my study, you will see that the majority of the sample identified as Black or white. The majority of the sample they were highly educated in the 15 to 20 year category. However, a majority were in the low income levels, although you will see that men were more represented in the higher income category. For the age, most people were in the 26 to 30 age range. And however, you will notice that the men in the sample were a lot older. The oldest man was 55 and the oldest woman was 37. And I did check that. It just is a large age gap in some of the relationships. But so all the women were younger and still within childbearing years. Most people were married in the sample. Most people did not have any live births or children. And most people were using birth control at the last time of sexual intercourse. Now to get into some of the bivariate relationships with our main predictors and the outcome, I can just go through briefly the differences that were significant. You'll see in the age category, there are significant differences between the groups, where it appears that younger women are more represented in those couples using birth control. And in the education, these were also significant, where both highly educated women and highly educated men were more represented in those using birth control. Finally, in the income levels, those where men were in the high income were more represented in couples using birth control. So moving on to the correlations, this is just kind of just progressively trying to look at the independent relationships between the predictors and the outcome. You will see that women's and men's education level is significantly correlated, which is consistent with the descriptives, positively correlated, and men's income positively correlated with usage within the relationship. And finally, you'll see that decision-making power is negatively positively correlated with birth control use. So this is illustrating that women who indicated less decision-making power in their relationships are more likely to be using birth control within that couple. And however, you'll see that the gender scale is negative, although not significant in the correlations. And then what I did with the logistic regression model was basically just trying to take account of some of these independent relationships and the controls to see if they still persist. And what you will see is that and I will note that this is all the women's characteristics in this model, just because that was just an analytic choice for this step to just look at women's characteristics. But you'll see that in the highly educated versus the low educated groups, women more likely to use birth control. You will notice white women are more likely to be using birth control, and those who are highly avoidant of pregnancy are more likely to be using birth control in their relationships. And finally, this is the main kind of point of the analyses. This is the logistic diagonal reference model, and this technique is similar to the logistic regression model, which you'll see here. Looks kind of like the table. However, what's unique about it is that it is able to model similarity and differences between the groups. So going back to how I measured education and income, this is able to pair women and men who have similar levels of education, and the reference group is essentially those who had differing levels of education. So this allows us to see when both education levels are similar, what does that relationship look like in predicting contraceptive use. So the only significant predictor in this is when both men and women are highly educated, which is reflected in some of the earlier descriptives and correlations. You'll see that younger women are more likely to be using birth control, highly avoidant women more likely to be using birth control, those with no or fewer children more likely to be using, and white women more likely to be using. So this is just, again, reflecting some of what we found. But the unique part of this diagonal reference model is that you are able to get the relative weights, which is what's pictured in the bottom. So this is showing that in the relationship above with the reference groups and the education levels, women's education level matters more for that relationship, since it's a 0.72 over a 0.27 for the man. So although it's important that both men and women are highly educated at predicting this relationship, you can see that women's influence is a lot greater in that relationship. So just moving on to some of the significance and conclusions, going back to my earlier exploratory questions, how does structural power impact this use? It seems that education was very impactful for predicting use after kind of progressively controlling for the other potential variables. Question 2, are the characteristics of men or women more influential? And you'll see, or the diagonal reference model kind of demonstrated that women's education levels are more influential in predicting the relationship. Traditional gender role beliefs were not significant predictors in any of my findings. And decision-making power was negatively related to use and correlations, but this relationship disappears in the control models. And then finally, just to go over some contributions and limitations from this current study, I essentially were replicating previous findings that education and some of the other controls are impacting use. However, the diagonal reference model isn't often used in these types of studies, or it's been used on different types of methods. So this is really just allowing us to demonstrate quantitatively whose influence matters more. So that's a contribution of this work. However, some limitations, the sample is limited. I did use list-wise deletion, although I don't anticipate that the findings would change significantly. And in my models, I only looked at women's decision-making and didn't show the income for today. But some future possibility would be comparing models with men's characteristics. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. And now we have Johnny, who is, there he is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Johnny. I'll be discussing today the gay men of color and how they navigate sexual racism. To begin with, my research question is fairly straightforward. How do gay men of color navigate sexual racism? Their reactions to sexual racism is varied. Some of them avoided it, others tolerated it to a degree, and some struggle to even make sense of it. So why all of these different reactions? To answer that, we should consider that when people react to the same stimulus in different ways, then the answer should be found in the commonalities of the people who exhibit similar reactions. So what do we need to know to identify what are the relevant commonalities that dictate their reactions? Well, first, we need to talk about their perceptions of racism. When encountering instances of sexual racism, respondents have to first be able to identify and make sense of it. First thing to consider then is the presence or absence of these toolkits. Then we come to the given instance of sexual racism. Where does it happen? With what frequency? And what does it look like? And then we can get to their reaction, which is how, once we make sense of these individual toolkits and what sexual racism look like, then we can begin to make sense of these interactions. However, through my interviews, I noticed two things that complicated the situation: the vast difference in the skills necessary to identify racism and the impact of access to queer spaces. To understand how and whether or not respondents had the skills to identify and respond to racism, we have to understand their racial socialization, which I use to mean growing up with an understanding of what it means to be non-white in America. Then we have to contextualize this within a social climate in which gay spaces are disappearing and being replaced with gay cliques. While there are a bevy of forces causing the loss of queer spaces, what's important to this dynamic is the outcome. Queer spaces of color are among the first to close, and what spaces remain become mainstream, white, and racist. Quickly, I wanted to talk about my methods. My population was gay men of color. They ranged in age from 25 to 47. They were Black, Latino, and Asian, and were predominantly located on the East Coast. I used a snowball sampling recruitment method. So I identified some potential participants who then identified other participants and referred them to me. The interviews lasted about an hour, and they explored queer racial identity and spaces. And due to my insider status as also being a gay man of color, many respondents communicated to me that I was seen as trustworthy and responsible enough to create nuanced research. So let's talk about the socialization of race. My respondents could be broadly categorized into three groups. The first of which is Black men. Black men had the highest degree of racial salience, as parents often made an effort to teach them about being Black, and Black respondents often had close ties to their communities, citing cultural experiences like family gatherings or attending predominantly Black schools that made an effort to teach them about Black history. Lastly, respondents all had experienced fairly intense racism and usually had been taught by their parents to navigate it. This resulted in them having a strong connection to their Blackness and plenty of experience identifying and navigating racism. This second group of respondents were child undocumented immigrants. Their status as non-white was always salient due to their ever-present fear of deportation. The threat of deportation means that undocumented communities become tight-knit, as these are some of the few spaces where they feel safe. Not only that, but growing up undocumented, these respondents found themselves getting involved in activist communities, which further strengthened their ties to their culture and their ability to identify and navigate racism. These respondents also discussed their homes as a place of strong cultural immersion, usually in the form of speaking their native tongue. The last group are second generation immigrants, or as they refer to themselves, first generation Americans. These respondents had relatively low racial salience. While they did not lack exposure to their own culture, they seemed to regard their cultural heritage as more of an idiosyncrasy than a formative experience of their life. This disconnect seemed to arise from parents who encouraged them to assimilate into whiteness, which prevented meaning making about any cultural practices they did carry out at home. Because of this pressure to assimilate, these respondents felt very comfortable navigating white spaces and faced very little overt racism, though they lacked the tools to identify and confront the more subtle forms of racism they did encounter. A second factor in this dynamic is the disappearance of gay spaces. This is both literal and metaphorical, as as gayness becomes more accepted, gay spaces are replaced with gay cliques. As one of my respondents noted, Michael, he doesn't need a gay space because him and his friends are safe enough to create a gay space wherever they go. The literal disappearance of gay spaces is also a problem, as research has shown that as they disappear, the racism gay men experience increases. This increase stems from two factors. First, queer spaces of color are among the first to close, leaving these men without a space to call their own, and they are left with the dilemma of creating their own spaces or assimilating into white spaces. Second, the spaces that do remain have to deal with gentrifying processes and the rise of homonormativity in and the rise of homonormativity that goes along with it. Homonormativity is a complex phenomenon that can be thought of as gay assimilation. Gay individuals gain acceptance by adopting mainstream values and taste, which include notions of race and gender. Because of this, the remaining gay spaces become de facto white spaces, and as such become increasingly hostile to queer people of color. Most of these are some quotes from my respondents. Most of my respondents were able to identify sexual racism to a degree. One of the most surprising findings to me was how often respondents explicitly identified their fetishization. So as you can see in like a few of these quotes explicitly say that they have felt fetishized. Though, like Daniel describes in the first quote, sexual racism is experienced through the extremes of both fetishization and exclusion. It's important to note, however, that these two extremes are a result of othering. Men of color are reduced to stereotypes about their race, and whether or not these men receive attention is a result of who these stereotypes appeal to. One of the biggest differences between respondents was not if they were able to identify sexual racism, but rather how willing they were to trust their own perceptions. Respondents with a high degree of racial salience trusted their perceptions of sexual racism to the degree that the evaluation process seemed almost instantaneous. On the other hand, respondents with low racial salience often doubted their own perceptions. For example, whenever Daniel, a gay Asian man, discussed his experiences with exclusion, he would often backtrack and alter his statement from a declaration of fact, I am being excluded for being Asian, to a description of his perception. My perception is that I am being excluded for being Asian. Regardless of their case, of their ease in making sense of the racism they encountered, all respondents experienced a degree of strain from these interactions. In their quest to manage these strain, respondents utilize the varying toolkits they have developed and to identify and navigate racism, and harness whatever access to queer spaces they have to develop strategies to minimize or cope with the strain they experience. This finally brings us to the actual strategies they deploy. Um, so what are they? Often they create new queer spaces geared to their own racial or ethnic group. They periodically and temporarily withdraw from mainstream gay spaces to recover from the strain caused by sexual racism, or they reframe their experiences as existing within their perception and do their best to assimilate. The create tactic is deployed by individuals with high racial salience and access to queer communities of color. Individuals who deploy this tactic do their best to avoid mainstream queer spaces as a way to minimize their encounters with sexual racism. Instead, they create spaces, whether they be formal or informal, where them and their peers can exist in peace. These spaces are a way to reimagine queerness in culturally relevant ways and address the more homophobic aspects of their own cultures. However, creating these spaces requires both a lot of labor and access to a relevant peer group. And due to their nature as deliberately constructed havens from whiteness, they tend to be politically charged spaces. The withdraw tactic is primarily employed by individuals with high racial salience, but no access to racially or ethnically appropriate peer groups, or alternately by individuals who are turned off by the highly political atmosphere of created spaces. Individuals who deploy this tactic make use of mainstream gay spaces, tolerating sexual racism until the strain becomes too much, at which point they'll withdraw to recover before eventually rejoining the space. Lastly is the assimilate tactic, which is usually deployed by individuals with low racial salience, and they attempt to assimilate into mainstream gay spaces by using the at times ambiguous nature of sexual racism to reframe their own experiences. These individuals attempt to adopt mainstream gay values to some degree, usually focusing on becoming more outgoing and charismatic, and possibly even downplaying their own racial identity. In this way, they're able to diffuse the tension of sexual racism by minimizing the opportunities for others to be racist and dismissing racism when it happens as only existing in their perception. So going forward, I wanted to increase the diversity of my respondents. By and large, the vast majority of my respondents were Black, and Black respondents all had high racial salience due to the prominence of anti-Black racism in the US, which means that I did not have a lot of data for respondents with low racial salience. Additionally, my interview schedule needs to be updated as it is geared primarily to exploring the tensions between respondents' dual identities more broadly and not the racism they encounter within gay spaces specifically. Although many of these discussions arose naturally in the course of the interview, I want to include explicit questions around what it is like to date and the pressure to present as masculine and straight. Exploring the pressure to act straight has a lot of potential to provide useful data, as ideas about masculinity are usually informed by race. And that brings us to the end of my presentation. And so I want to thank everybody for coming here.
Thank you. And Samar, you can start listening now.
Okay. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today and everyone for organizing this. So my presentation today is a look into my master's paper project that I've been working on this semester. And since the abstracts for this event were sent out, my project now actually has a title, which is really exciting. So today we're looking at No One Wins in the Oppression Olympics, a qualitative examination of intragroup conflict in the LGBTQ+ community. So to get us started with some general background information. Now, as we all know, the LGBTQ community is considered a minority group in the United States and globally as well. And because of this, most research on the community has looked at intergroup conflict between heterosexuality and queerness, since being queer in a heteronormative society tends to rub some people the wrong way, and this in turn creates a lot of tension, oppression, discrimination, and just some really negative outcomes overall. Now, with this research, you don't really see a lot of it that looks at individual identities within the community. Typically, every sexual or gender minority is sort of just lumped together, which creates an underlying assumption that the queer community exists as a sort of united front. Now, this isn't something that is unique to the queer community. We also see this kind of lumping of identities in the Black community as well, where everyone is sort of seen as being on the same page because of their skin color and not really accounting for individual differences that may come up as a result of differentiation across ethnicity, culture, gender, whatever it may be. And this lack of acknowledgement of this differentiation can overall lead to some very bad policy practice, where people who are outside of the community who are trying to create legislation for these communities may only really be benefiting certain subsections of them rather than the community as a whole. Now, when it comes to the queer community itself, there is evidence that things may not necessarily be hunky-dory all the time. Can I say hunky-dory in an academic presentation? I don't know. But this is most evident on social media sites like Twitter, Tumblr, and Reddit, where we see varying members of the community sort of at a crossroads when it comes to who belongs in the community and who doesn't, and who is valid in their identity and who isn't. And so this brings us to one of my favorite philosophical questions, which is simply, why should I care? Why does this matter? What is the point of this? And to answer this, we'll start by discussing what intragroup conflict actually is and why it matters. So according to Witt, intergroup conflict boils down to the processes that underlie conflict dynamics between group members with shared interests or defining characteristics. So essentially, we're talking about conflict and competition between group members as opposed to conflict between whole groups themselves. Most of the work that has been done in this area comes from psychology and sociology, and it usually focuses on employees in organizational settings or members of sports teams. And although this is kind of different from the population that I'm looking at, pretty much all of the literature on this topic tends to come to two main conclusions. First, the more conflict that is present between members of a group, the less effective they are in achieving their common goals. I imagine all of us have some sort of experience with this when it comes to a really poorly done group project that we've been a part of at some point. And two, we need to understand conflict in order to figure out how to get rid of it, which may sound like a bit of a no-brainer, but it is a key step in this whole process. Now, there isn't a whole lot of work that looks at conflict within minority groups specifically, and there is even less of it when it comes to conflict in the LGBTQ community. However, it does exist. And evidence of gay rights movements dates back as early as the 1870s. And over the years, as these movements have sort of evolved in members and in goals, a battle of inclusion has sort of risen as well, where people who are not considered veterans of the community find themselves fighting for a way into it. We see this a lot with identities that are more fluid. So this includes identities like bisexuality, pansexuality, and gender nonconforming members. Now, what I want us all to be sort of cognizant of here is that I'm not saying that these members are just having difficulties in being accepted by heteronormative culture. They are, but the issue here is that even within the LGBTQ community itself, they're also struggling to be accepted by more rigid identifying members. And that includes people who mostly identify as gay or lesbian. One primary example is actually TERF lesbians, or trans exclusionary radical feminist lesbians, who believe that those who identify as transgender women cannot also identify as lesbians because they're not considered real women. So this all brings us to my project this semester. So to date, there is one comprehensive quantitative study that looks at intragroup attitudes in the LGBT community. And it's an undergraduate thesis that was conducted back in 2012. In this study, the researchers sent out a survey to a little over 500 LGBT members, asking them questions pertaining to stigma, discrimination, level of outness, and contact that they had with other people who are queer. Results from the study found two kind of main findings, which were that one, gays and lesbians tend to hold negative attitudes about bisexual men and women. And two, gay men held more negative attitudes about transgender men. Now, what's important to note about the study is that it was quantitative, and therefore the questionnaire for it was mostly using Likert scales and sort of yes/no questions. So there wasn't much information regarding the potential driving mechanisms behind these negative attitudes. And that's kind of what interests me personally. So with my project, I really want to kind of look at two things. One, examine how conflict presents itself in the community. And two, assess the effects that it can have on both its members and the collective group as a working unit. So for my project, I decided to sit down with people in the LGBTQ community and conduct some semi-structured interviews over Zoom. Interviews lasted between 60 to 90 minutes in length, and about 15 questions, give or take total. And the questions focused on identity formation, interpersonal relationships, group membership, and community activism. And here we have sort of my participants' demographic breakdown. For my recruitment, I used a snowball sampling method. I actually had started this project last semester in Professor Leveren's class, Qualitative Methods. And in that class, I had interviewed 4 people in the community, and those people kind of became my key sort of people in the recruitment process for this project. So for my demographics, I interviewed 15 people this semester. They were aged between 20 and 30 years. The gender breakdown, we had 8 cisgender women, 2 cisgender men, 4 non-binary people, and 1 agender person. Sexuality-wise, we had 2 gays, 2 lesbians, 5 bisexuals, 1 pansexual, 2 queer people, 2 homoromantic asexuals, and 1 fluid gray asexual. And race, most people were white, with 1 participant identifying as mixed. As for my data analysis process, all interviews were recorded and I transcribed them manually, which I definitely underestimated how long that would take and will probably not be doing that next time. But from there, I coded each transcript manually as well. And this was sort of my process with that. So I read through all of the transcripts and looked for repetition of specific terminology, unique anecdotes, concepts that speak to previous literature or new concepts of interest overall. From there, I identified themes and assigned them individual colors, and then those themes were compared across transcripts, and then I narrowed them down for final analysis. In total, I ended up having about 23 total themes, but we didn't do that for this paper. That will be for something else, hopefully in the future. Now we can get into the fun stuff, which is the results. So like I said, I ended up coding about 23 themes, but this is kind of what made the final cut. The 3 main themes that we'll kind of be looking at today are label politics, in-group oppression, and desire for change. So first, we can begin with label politics. Now, throughout our conversations, respondents disclosed their gender identity and their sexual identity, and they gave their own personal definitions of what their labels meant, and explained how their definitions could be similar to or different from how other people might perceive those labels to be. So this kind of gave rise to some sort of conflicting narratives, where some people who identified as bisexual and pansexual, for example, were giving the same exact definitions of what they thought their identity meant in terms of attraction, even though they still would not have considered that. They each kind of were like, but I am firm in the idea that I am bisexual, I am not pan, and vice versa. So here we have this quote by Sean, who is a 23-year-old gay man, kind of illustrating the acknowledgement of this confusion that exists. So he says, I think LGBTQ plus is very broad. I feel like lumping everyone together in one community just because they are not straight cisgender people is kind of confusing, or not confusing, but conflicting, because I think a lot of people with even like being gay, people have a lot of different definitions about what that means to them. So then adding other definitions on top of that, it makes it like confusing, I guess. Now, when it comes to labels, every one of my 15 respondents mentioned gatekeeping of labels at some point, whether explicitly using the term gatekeeping or just kind of conceptually describing it. Some people felt that gatekeeping of labels was a way for people to be selfish with their own labels by not allowing others to use it. And others kind of felt that gatekeeping was sometimes necessary in the community. So here we have a quote by Alan, a 24-year-old bisexual non-binary individual. And here they're discussing their position on how allowing for certain labels like fictosexual to be included in the community does more to damage the community than benefit it. And for those who are unfamiliar with what fictosexual means, sort of like how I was, it is basically sexual attraction to fictional characters. So Alan said, I never want to be that type of person who's like, you don't belong here. But also, gatekeeping has its place. Sounds awful, but like it's true. In certain spaces, whether that's to protect the youth or whether that's to protect the people in the space, sometimes gatekeeping really does have its place. And I hate saying it out loud because it sounds really gross, but I really believe it. Okay. And then the last sort of sub-theme under this label politics theme is heterosexual accommodation. So some people in my sample felt that defining labels and gatekeeping around labels was critical for the purpose of making the LGBTQ plus community more palatable for people outside of it. Here we have Selena, a 27-year-old bisexual woman, kind of get into that a little bit more. So this quote is on the longer side, so I won't read it, but basically she's describing how there's some tension between lesbians and bisexuals in the community because some bisexuals will try to claim the lesbian label despite liking men, and then they may communicate to people outside of the community that being a lesbian means you mostly date women, but sometimes you date men too, which is incorrect information. So then it becomes a slew of misinformation being spread across heterosexual society, and that kind of further marginalizes the people in these groups. The second theme we'll be looking at is in-group oppression. And this is sort of where you see most of the conflict that exists in the community. I'd like to start off by reading this quote by Brittany, who is a 25-year-old homo-romantic asexual woman. So she says, I feel like there's just an obscene amount of gatekeeping over like who's marginalized enough. I see where people are coming from, but I'm also like, first of all, no one wins the oppression Olympics. That is not something that any of us can win. We're all losers in that situation. People will turn, I feel like, a lot of valid complaints that they have with like a lack of intersectionality and feminism in the LGBT community into, if you are X identity, you don't matter as much, very quickly, concerningly quickly. Now, this quote is important for two main reasons. First, it's the title of this project, which is kind of cool because this moment right now is kind of like when an actor mentions the title of the movie in the movie. So this is kind of what we're experiencing. But more importantly, this sort of allows us to see a sense of competition emerging in the community. And that competition is based in something, well, oppression specifically. And that something is typically something that members will experience from outside of the community, but now it is being perpetuated inside of the community as well. Now, oppression in the community can manifest in a few different ways. Here we focus on how it can manifest as in terms of intersectionality and in terms of cliques. So from an intersectional lens, those who are both gender and sexual minorities tend to experience more hate in the community. Here we have Thomas, who is a 24-year-old pansexual non-binary individual. And they recall an incident they had with someone they were talking to on a dating app. So they say, I was talking to a guy for quite some time. I hadn't said anything. I didn't say I was trans. I didn't put it in my bio. I was just like, let's try this. And it was going really well. I'd probably say we were talking for a month maybe. And then I finally said something. He was just like, oh, I don't think it's going to work out. And then we stopped talking immediately. Now, this oppression can also come more directly through exclusionary and discriminatory behavior in the form of cliques in the community. So here we have Madison, who is a 23-year-old bisexual woman, and she recalls an anecdote from her undergraduate days where she sort of, she was living on the arts floor of her college campus, and the arts floor had a group of lesbians who she describes as almost being cult-like, because they would kick people out of their groups sometimes and they would kind of exile people. And she says how you don't really expect queer people to be mean like that, but it happens sometimes, which is odd. And then the final theme we'll be looking at is a desire for change. So, so throughout our conversations, everyone mentioned something that they wished could be different about the community. So this first quote is by Alan, who is, did I not put there? Oh, let me see if I can remember in my memory because I forgot to put it in my notes. Alan is a 24-year-old non-binary bisexual. Yes. And so Alan felt that it is important for members to learn their history and to sort of educate themselves on the community in order to sort of avoid tension in the community. So they say, I just want people to learn their history. That really boils down to it. So much of the harm that's perpetuated is by people who haven't read it. If they don't, then what are we doing? We're sitting here grinding our gears. And I think the most crystalline and specific example of that is the fact that pansexual people don't. A lot of sort of emerging people who attach themselves to that label don't claim bisexual history as their own. So Alan here was making the argument that bisexual history is an integral part of pansexual history, and a lot of people who sort of classify themselves as pan don't read up on their history. And then similar desires for change were expressed by Jack, who was a 30-year-old agender, I believe fluid. I will fact check that later. But so he was saying that he'd like to have a unification of sorts in the goals that people are interested in the queer community, because I think we can disagree about how we're going to get there to a certain extent, but if we don't have the same goals, a lot of this is going to be so hard. If we could have like a queer unified statement of interest, that would be kind of cool. So this desire for unity was expressed by several others as well. One respondent in my sample actually compared the division among LGBTQ members to that of the division among liberals, where there are many people wanting to create change, but none of them can agree on how to make that change happen. And so as a result, the conservatives, or in this case, sort of straight homophobic people, end up winning. And that's simply because their bond that is based in hatred is much stronger. So all of this being said, some key takeaways. Now, this is the part where I leave you hanging in a bit of suspense simply because I have not finished my paper yet. But these are sort of some initial takeaways that I'm coming to terms with. So first, most of the conflict that exists in the community begins with an issue of identity differentiation. And this is kind of what we see with label politics and with sort of not having a well-defined understanding of what certain labels mean and who can identify with them and who can't. Second, which aligns quite well with what the literature tells us, people who fall under more fluid identities tend to experience some forms of rejection from those with more rigid identities. And then third, also, I like the literature we have on intra-group conflict, which kind of tells us that the presence of conflict makes it more challenging to accomplish common tasks and goals. Members of the community acknowledge this conflict as a hindrance for their community's growth. And then as for my limitations, because this is qualitative work, obviously we're going to have some issues in generalizability and representativeness. I will say that I did make an effort throughout the recruitment process to try and get as wide of a variety of identities under the LGBTQ umbrella as possible. Obviously, I didn't have much control over that because I did use a snowball sampling method, so it was kind of just who people knew. But I did sort of tell people, like, if you happen to know someone of this identity that there aren't many people of in my sample, I'd really appreciate you reaching out to them. And then also, there was just, this kind of ties into the second limitation, which is a lot of these more marginalized fluid identities tend to be harder to find simply because there's not as many of them. You're going to find a lot more gay people in the community than you are going to find trans people, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of makes it a little bit more difficult. And then final limitation is just sort of a scarcity in literature around this topic, which made it kind of difficult to sort of figure out how to approach it, or like how to go about my interview guide and all of that, because there wasn't much for me to figure out what are the right questions to ask and how do I go about doing this work. So that was kind of a limitation as I was sort of formulating how I want to go about this. And those are my references. And yeah, that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you all. This is fantastic. I love all of your projects, and it has been fun to sort of see them evolve over a period of time as your work has sort of progressed. I'm going to make just a couple of observations and ask maybe one question of each of you. My notes are all over the place, so hopefully this is semi-coherent. I mean, and in some ways, your presentation sort of easily fit together, but some of the commonalities I see across the presentations, first is the emphasis on dimensions of power in interpersonal and romantic and sexual relationships. And we see that the sort of different dimensions of power, including race, including gender, sexuality, and both within and across group membership. And so there are sort of interesting connections there. Some in very obvious ways and some in less obvious ways, I think. And also you all talked about various ways in which context matters, and context is important. As a sociologist, of course, that is interesting and important. I think Johnny talked about queer spaces and the decline of queer spaces and what that means. We also have a sort of broader social context of the influence of things like patriarchy and white supremacy and anti-Black racism, age to some degree, historical context. And so it's sort of like all of your projects, I think, are influenced by being in the present moment. And then we also saw this interesting tension between individual identities and group identities, and how they sort of both shaped and supported or didn't support one another, and kind of when one was more important than the other. A couple of questions, and you all can, I'm going to just throw all of the questions out there and you can answer them and respond across, and then I'll open it up to other people. Alyssa, you touched on the end of, well, and I will preface my questions for Alyssa by saying that I'm also very influenced by the qualitative work that you were doing on a similar topic last semester. And I think you know how much I love that aspect as well. The quantitative is interesting. And I wondered why you mentioned at the end that you weren't looking at men's gender attitudes. And so I'm curious why you sort of set that aside, at least for now, or in this presentation, and how that may shape the results. So not only looking at structural power, but also the sort of interpersonal power. And related to that, and particularly as I'm connecting it in my own head to your earlier work, if you broke apart and looked at different forms of birth control separately rather than together, if you had that data, you, yeah. So I won't go into that more unless you know as much about that as I do from your interviews last semester. And Johnny, so you were talking primarily about this, you sort of looked at this full group identity of queer men of color. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about othering that you may have seen and heard about within that larger group. So for example, you sort of identified the importance of the Black male experience. And so I'm wondering, like, did Black men also feel fetishized or excluded by other men of color, for example? Um, and I was also sort of interested in this question that Samar brought up of gatekeeping and how that may have played out, of who belongs within these spaces or within these cliques and who doesn't, and how that may have come up. Um, and then Samar, you were kind of looking all at this in-group conflict. And I'm wondering how, so Johnny's paper was sort of set up as like the in-group with an at least an implicit connection to the experience of queer white men, right? And then Samar really broke it down in a much more nuanced way of all of the different sort of identities and experiences within this broader umbrella of LGBTQ plus. And so I'm kind of interested in the like for Samar, how that in-group conflict connects, or what it says about the out-group conflict, and sort of and even like if there's all of these different experiences and different identities and tension within those experiences and identities within this larger umbrella group, does that larger umbrella group serve a role, and what is that role? So kind of I'll stop babbling there and let you see if you can figure out what I'm trying to say to any of you.
I can answer first some of your questions. Yes, this was very influenced by the work I did in Professor Leverence's class, and I am very interested in power dynamics with specific methods. I was focused more on hormonal methods originally. I think the choice to just look at all methods was one of simplicity, and just with knowing that I could go back and add to that, or maybe look at a different outcome in the future. As far as only looking at men's character or not looking at men's characteristics, it was a similar kind of practical choice, just to make it as simple as possible, and then potentially build on that work. But yes, I definitely have plans to look more at those methods, because there is a lot of work to suggest that they're treated differently. So,
well, and just a tiny little comment on the method. I, like thinking about, you were initially interested in hormonal, but one of the things that seemed really like that's what women can control the most in shaping their own decisions, versus condom use, for example, where you sort of have to get your male partner on board with that and kind of what those dimensions mean. So
yeah, it was kind of a drawback from using this data as well, because I had a choice to use kind of the National Survey of Family Growth, which is what most people use in the birth control research, although you cannot get reports from the man. So it was kind of, again, a choice just to balance, to get the reports from the man. I kind of let that part of it go, but in the future, want to look more into that, definitely.
I can go next. So regarding the othering by other people, like of queer people of color by other queer people of color, So the way I structured my interviews was to like, I asked them about like, what's your experience like being a person of color? What does it mean to be Black? So on and so forth. And respondents themselves, and it maybe, I shouldn't say that, maybe like the framing of person of color creates like this white, non-white dichotomy. But respondents all generally felt like, I mean, I use person of color when it's convenient, but I am Asian, I am Black, I am Latinx, whatever. Um, and they would not talk to me about like intergroup dynamics between different people of color groups, like unless I asked them. They themselves always framed it as like white versus my ethnic racial group. I think part of it has to do with like homonormative pressures that, which is like really complex. And I gave like a very brief definition, because homonormative pressures like makes gay mean white. And so the mostly when they talked about conflict between different people of color groups, it was those who tried to assimilate into whiteness. So it was always like the people who tried to assimilate to whiteness would, I think, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say this because I'm not 100% sure, but they would sometimes kind of be more racist because they needed to create that like that distance between themselves and like non-whiteness. Um, so in general, there was not a lot of talking about other people of color. And when it wasn't necessarily like, oh, like this group treats us that way. It's like the people of color who want to assimilate into whiteness treat us this way. Um, about who belongs in this spaces and gatekeeping. Um, can you elaborate on that question?
Um, me? So I think you kind of started to touch on it in your answer to the last question, but I'm also thinking about this sort of transition from gay spaces to gay cliques, um and sort of how, whether or not people sort of clearly identified who they wanted to be in that space or in that clique, or whether it was, because it kind of seems like there's at least implied gatekeeping of who they want their clique to be.
So, I mean, I think the gatekeep to answer that question is going to be a little bit complicated because then it just depends on like the individual personalities of the people in the clique and their own personal biases, because the functioning of the gay cliques, and maybe clique isn't an appropriate term because it kind of implies a level of exclusion that might not be honest. It's more this replacement of like these gay clubs, which were the spaces where like you went and you met community there. And then suddenly these are being replaced with, oh, I know gay people and like we just have a friend group and we hang out. And like that's our gay space. The people who created spaces were the ones who would like create spaces deliberately. Um, those were probably the most gatekeepy insofar as like the very nature of them. So, you know, they were usually very politically activist. So those who kind of didn't like just wanted a space to hang out and chill with friends, like might pull away from those spaces. And, you know, if they're like politically active progressive spaces, then like maybe more conservative members might pull away as well. And so but I think that also has to do more with the very nature and function of this space than active gatekeeping. There are more questions. I will read them, but Samar, you can go.
Okay, so I want to make sure that I understood your question. So were you asking how the in-group conflict connects to outer group conflict and like how it mirrors it, or what was the question exactly?
Kind of, yeah. And so like, so, and I'm also, again, thinking of this in sort of tension with Johnny's focus, or in tension with, you know, like his is kind of queer men in some ways against white men, and you have all of the sort of dimensions within the community. And so what does that, did you get any sense of both the importance of an umbrella community for the people that you were talking to, and how that sort of connected to the sort of heteronormativity of the broader world? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think when talking to, okay, I will say midway through my interviews, as I was doing them, I added a question there where I kind of asked people if they feel like there's a hierarchy in the LGBTQ community. And the reason why I added that question was because some people started to sort of bring up that concept and like the fact that there might be a little bit earlier, like when I was first starting my interviews. And when I would ask people this, most of them agreed that there was some sort of hierarchy. And usually that hierarchy was, it started with, you know, white gays, similar to kind of what Johnny was just saying about, you know, what we know. So it would start with white gay men at the top, and then lesbian women, white lesbian women next, and then it would kind of go in that order. And then anyone who identified as sort of a kind of, which, you know, my presentation touched on, like anyone who identified with sort of more fluid identities would be kind of just at the bottom somewhere, and you would just kind of be lower and lower on the totem pole depending on what other intersections you had to deal with, whether it was your race or gender or whatever it might be. I will say that some of my respondents, the way that they viewed the community was that it was necessary to have it because if everyone sort of just did what they want and we didn't acknowledge that there was an existence of an LGBTQ community, it would be easier in some sense, because then there wouldn't be this sort of fighting over what labels one person should identify with versus another. But it would be harder when it came to doing anything that was pragmatic or anything in terms of policy and in terms of tangible change, because they wouldn't feel like they would have sort of a unified voice that could be fighting to create some sort of change for these like lesser people. I will say there was so I mentioned it in my presentation, but I didn't talk about, I guess, like the extent of it, but there was a very large emphasis on how people viewed other members of the community as trying very, very hard to sort of mirror what heterosexuality looks like, and sort of also, you know, making their identities more palatable for heterosexuals. And, you know, I remember this one respondent in particular, she phrased it very well. And the way that she said it was that there's a lot of queer people who kind of will say, you know, like, let's say I'm a gay male. They'll be like, oh, I'm a gay male. My identity is really easy to understand. So this is what being gay means. I don't want you focusing on like the bisexuals who can't choose, or I don't want you focusing on like the trans people who don't know like what gender they are one day versus another day. Like I'm very easy to understand as someone who is just gay and cisgender. So this is what being gay should look like. And this is kind of what I want people outside of the community to perceive the community as. And so I would say that I think people acknowledge the need for a community, but I think people also acknowledge that a lot of people in the community are trying their absolute hardest to kind of, whether it's to mirror heterosexuality in kind of the way that it is presented and the things that they do and the rituals that they do, or they just want the community as a whole to be more understood by heterosexuality. And their way of doing that is sort of by oppressing other members in the community that kind of are a little bit more weird or more abnormal than sort of what is seen as a normal gay or a normal lesbian or whatever it might be. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that's great. And so I think we now have questions for everybody in the chat. And those of you that posted questions, feel free to actually say them out loud or just have people read, but we can just go down the list. I think, Johnny, the first two are for you.
Can I have a quick question for Samara, and like I posted it in the chat because I think it kind of, so like for me there was a lot of importance about passing or like being straight acting. Did you get like in like how these hierarchies function? Did you get like similar discussions?
So I would say, so the concept of passing came up a lot when I was talking to anyone who is bisexual, and it really came up in terms of just feeling invalidated when bisexual people would pass as straight people because they were in a heterosexual relationship. So for example, a bi woman being in a relationship with a man, she's still bisexual. But because she's in a relationship with a man, most people just assume that she is straight. And that comes from within the community as well. And she described it mostly being prominent at things like pride festivals, where she would go to pride and she'd be holding hands with her boyfriend and someone would yell at her like, oh, what is this straighty doing here? Like, this is pride. Even though pride is open to allies as well, but some people, to each their own, some people have opinions about that. So yeah, passing came up, I would say, mostly in the context of being invalidated by other members for kind of looking like you're a straight person.
It's really interesting just because like the whole idea of like being passing and straight acting is like a very fraught issue because one, homonormativity prizes conforming to heteronormative ideals and gender normative expectations, right? And two, like passing means safety, right? If you can't be identified as being queer, that means you're able to evade a lot of like directed aggression. But there's also like these different issues with gatekeeping and how passing is used to gatekeep. So first, Heather, so the way spaces tend to be conceptualized is physical. I think it's because there is there is just something very important about having a set physical space where you can engage with. A lot of these spaces tend to be bars, but that's just part of I think that's a lot of history where most the spaces that tend to be geared towards gay people have historically been bars. With COVID, I personally have had experience with online spaces, but they haven't come up in my interviews, so I don't want to talk about them too much because my experience isn't, I mean, my experience is data, but it's not it's one person. What was it? So when spaces were created, they did tend to be physical spaces, though sometimes the space was every Friday we got together at so-and-so's apartment and watch Netflix. And that's our queer space. But it was the very act of having a physical space that was very important to these two like people who opted for creating spaces. Um, for Shannon, relationships were very interesting because relationships often tended to be spaces where people who assimilated tended to cross over to creating spaces after experiencing like sexual racism within their relationships. I have had a couple of horror stories from respondents where like they were like, I had to explain to my white boyfriend like why Black Lives Matter is important. But that being said, while people who tended to lean away from like assimilating tended to prefer not getting into interracial relationships with white people, it also wasn't like it like completely off limits or anything. They like there were a couple of people who were like who chose the tactic of creating space and had interracial relationships. So interracial relationships can be where a lot of these conflicts happen.
I can go. I think there's a question also from Tim in the chat asking about structural power markers besides education. Yeah, so I also used income, and that's going to be like in the full paper, but just didn't talk about it too much today, just because I still have to kind of work through what those mean in the analysis. So yeah, definitely using income for the structural power measurement. And your question about oh,
sorry, I did before you went to that one. I just wanted to have a follow-up question on that. So I guess yeah. Sorry, I think of like structural power. I'm just kind of curious of what you mean by it because I think of education like there couldn't be structural power there, but having an education of itself, I think of like more of like a cultural marker. Like if you get like your PhD, that you have a lot of cultural capital or something like that. But I think of like a structural power more in the sense of like being the department chair at a university, like education in that sense. I think of like Kamala Harris is like probably being the woman with the most structural power or something like that. You know what I mean? I'm thinking like in terms of like institutions.
yeah.
Is that kind of where you're going? Because like I think it would be interesting to see like how like if there was a measure where it asked women, what is your occupation? Because even something like income, I don't know, you even see like literature like on women that are CEOs don't have as much structural power. Maybe they do, probably, or maybe that's not a great analogy, but I'm just that's kind of where I was going with that, just to be clarified.
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting, that's not a different way of thinking of it. I guess my choice to use education income kind of just comes from the literature, and that's kind of how they're defining structural power in terms of relationally in broader society, having higher education means something, I guess, and then relationally, if you have more than your partner means something. So that's, I think, where that comes from. But your point is interesting and more like institutional. So yeah, that might just be like a naming of structural, kind of maybe signaling something that it's not how I thought about it. But your question about religion is also interesting and came up in the early kind of formation of my study. I think I just made the choice to kind of subsume it under, like I had the choice between the gender beliefs and the kind of traditional gender beliefs and the religion, and I just made kind of the choice for the gender beliefs, which I assume are very related to kind of religious values. But that's definitely something I can go back and look at. There was quite a few questions on there about religious values. So yeah, I think that there's definitely literature for that as well, or an argument for looking at the relationship as well.
I think evangelical, if they had something like there, would be a really, because I think there's a big, because like I imagine if they said they're Catholic, it's probably not going to be a great, most Catholics probably use birth control, but I'm just thinking of like evangelicals, like newer, not necessarily newer, but they're using it. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious to see how, because even the term is sort of broad enough that when someone identifies as like evangelical, it's not really a religious, like a political connotation now. Like I'm just kind of seeing like the infusion of religion and cultural values, how that would lead to a view that impacts birth control. Just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that I think jives really well with what I'm trying to capture. So kind of figuring out a way to incorporate that in the future might be really productive. So yeah, I agree.
Alyssa, can I just add a clarifying question? When you were measuring education and income, were you also looking at relative to the partner? Like if or just sort of education level as an individual characteristic?
So education and income is both relational. And what I'm going to be doing with the income is similar to what I showed with the education levels. So it's going to be pairing up like, do they both have low income? Do they both have high income? So yeah, it's relational in that way. And then I think Laura had a comment about Harley Hochschild. Yes, I definitely am citing her a lot in my work. So I've also read that book, and I think it's really relevant to the study. And I know there's a lot of literature that conceptualizes fertility work or as like another form of domestic labor and is unequal in that way. So definitely have that as well. So thanks for the comment. Oh, I can just, so Laura, the parity variable in the my analyses that addresses whether they have children. It's how many births you've had. So yeah, thanks.
Alyssa, did you have much? I mean, you mentioned at least a couple of couples that had large age gaps. Did you have enough variation there to include that as a consideration and a possible power dynamic within the relationship?
That's a good question. I believe it's just a few couples that had the really large age gaps. But I did go back and like make an age difference variable. So yeah, I could look at that definitely. See if they have a wider one.
We have a few minutes left. If we have any other, I think we've gotten to all of the questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions or if any of our panelists have any comments or questions. And if not, then we can thank you all for your fantastic work and our audience engagement and questions. I know this has been, hopefully this will be our only remote symposium and we'll be back in person soon. Yeah, fantastic job, everybody. I look forward to seeing your final products and seeing your work continue. And that's it. Thank you.